Welcome, friends, to Charted Waters, where we explore the Pacific Northwest through stories of nature, culture, and adventure. I'm Maureen Gordon. Join us as we uncover hidden wonders, untold histories, and deep connections between people and the wild here. Whether you're a curious traveler, a nature lover, or simply someone who finds solace in this coastal world, you're in the right place. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're diving into something unexpected, the breath of whales, and also a little messy, whale poop. Turns out both can be absolutely fascinating. With the right people around, these two gifts from whales can tell us things about the mystery of their lives here on the coast that we have just had no idea about for a long time. This is a topic that's near to my heart. I've stood on the deck of a ship and been awed by the colossal mouths of humpback whales and their long migratory journeys, and captivated by the beauty of orcas and the way they share food with one another. And I've always felt a little bit sad when they sort of roll and turn and head down with their tails pumping them off into the mysteries of their life, leaving a little bit of sense of loss for all of us at the surface. But recently, scientists have been using things they leave behind with us at the surface to delve into those mysteries of their lives. Today, we welcome two of those scientists to our podcast. They are DNA using detectives solving a handful of whodunits that help you learn more about who the whales are and what they need from us. Kait Yehle is a biologist at Skeena Wild here in British Columbia. Her area of specialty is stress hormones and fecal analysis. She's worked on cetacean research and conservation for quite a long time here with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the University of British Columbia, and Oceanwise. Welcome, Kait.
Thank you so much for having me on today. I'm excited to be here.
We're also delighted to welcome today our adventure guide, Alina Andrushko. She's worked with backcountry lodges and our own expedition cruise company, Maple Leaf Adventures, for a decade or so, taking people on holiday to explore this region. She's one of the rare non-scientists in the world, I think, with personal experience of whale poop. So we invited her on because we wanted you to be able to hear her special story. Welcome, Alina.
Thank you for having me.
And later in this podcast, I'll be speaking with Éadín O'Mahony about what she's learning about the relationships between humpback whales here through the breath they leave behind. So we've got the air and the water as our medium for discovery today. First, I'd like to set the scene a bit for our listeners, guys. Tell me about a transformational or very impactful moment you had here on this coast with cetaceans. It doesn't have to be about gathering samples, but what is it that kind of moved you about being able to live in proximity with these great creatures?
I guess I can speak up. It's Kait here. I grew up here on the south coast of British Columbia, so I think I've always felt a connection to the ocean. Always admired whales and other marine life from afar, but I would say a really transformational experience for myself was when I started research here on killer whales in particular, and the first time just actually being out on the water in fairly close proximity to killer whales, because I had never been on a whale watching tour as a kid or anything like that. So really seeing them up close was just like a moment I'll never forget. It is just so special.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes you out of yourself too at the same time as really resonates with everything inside, I find.
Definitely.
Alina, can you tell us about your inaugural day of whale feces sampling?
Yes, I am happy to. So during a trip, August 2022, in the Great Bear Rainforest, we had the wonderful ladies from Phil Island Research Station come on board Cascadia one evening to share some of their ongoing research. They had presented a lot on what we're talking about here, kind of highlighting how difficult it is to obtain both whale snot and poop using nets, drones, and sniffer dogs. So, fast forward, we're cruising down through Squally Channel on the southwest side of Gill Island the following morning. And off in the distance, we had these two beautiful humpbacks. So the captain positioned us. And then he shut down the engines, seeing that they weren't really going anywhere. And I'm not joking, it was probably 90 minutes of them just hanging out. One of the guests had pointed out some of these like bright pink logs in the water. And, I think one of the other crew members had said, like, I think it's poop. And when they said that, I went running. I was so stoked because we had just been talking about how hard it was to obtain whale scat. So I grabbed a PFD and the dip net from down to the lads, and then I radioed up to the captain and was like, "Don't move the boat. Like, I'm going to try and get some poop." And I can just imagine him rolling his eyes. Anyway, so I was definitely I felt like it was expecting it to be more like solid because this poop, like it looked solid. But the second I touched the net to it, it disintegrated and sank and spread and kind of became that, what we talk about in terms of like this, giant floating cloud. So I tore down to the galley. I got some Ziploc bags from the chef and ran out to the swim grid, which was kind of like the last chance for me to grab some because the boat still, the captain hadn't turned the engines on. So the boat was still just like floating and this poop was just like slowly going down the boat. And at this point, I wish I had a picture of it because there was a crew member holding the back of my PFD while a guest was holding the back of his PFD. And I was like half my body length over the side trying to scoop up this log of whale turd into the Ziploc bag. And, mission success. I was very, very excited about it. And we ended up putting it in the freezer because, it was whale poop. It was smelly. And I got in touch with Grace from Finn Island, whether or not she'd be interested in taking this off her hands and, like doing their science on it.
And what did she say?
She was definitely down for it. And then she also asked for some pictures so that they could potentially ID the whale. So, it was so great because all the guests were involved. And I think the excitement just got passed on because it was one of those like true learning moments of like, it was great.
Super dramatic. And so maybe, Ziploc bags and a chain of humans holding onto PFDs can become a new way of collecting whale poo. Who knew?
This is true.
Thank you for sharing that, Alina. And also thank you for your spirit of discovery and adventure in getting it.
You are welcome.
It's amazing the things you can become excited about when you know what they're connected to. At a high level, Kait, what, just in point form here, before we get into the details a bit later, what are we discovering from studying whales poop or whale feces? What are some of the most exciting things that we still have yet to learn, but that are possible?
That's a great question. So poo is this really amazing tool that can give all sorts of insights into different aspects of whales' lives, but it's really getting a comprehensive picture of health, like what's going on inside the whale in terms of the interactions with the environment. So, when there's pollutants in the water, you can see that in the feces of whales, that sorts of thing. You can look at what I did, which is hormones, which looks at stressors in the whales. You can look at what they're eating. I mean, it's just this tool that you can pull all the different pieces together and paint this really like comprehensive picture of what's going on internally inside the whale.
So amazing. So amazing. And we're going to take a look at some of those aspects in a few minutes as well with Kait. I wanted to give a little background though on this endeavor of science, as you might call it, scatology or poop science. It's been around and evolving for a while. When and how and why did studying whale poop really begin, Kait?
Ooh, I don't know if I have the answer to that question. Definitely before my time. I couldn't tell you the exact year that somebody first collected whale poo and decided to look at it. My guess would be within the past 20 years, but I could be off there. But it's definitely exploded, pardon the pun, as a field of study in the past 5 to 10 years. I would say there's a lot more researchers looking at it now.
Yeah, and how did you get into it?
I got into it. I was already involved in cetacean conservation research, looking at just anthropogenic impacts. And then I got involved with a team here in North Vancouver with Fisheries and Oceans Canada that was looking at was researching the southern resident killer whales in particular. And we really started to look at what tools we could use to research their health and conservation. And poop was one of the ones that came up as a really valuable tool, especially because it's relatively non-invasive. So when you're studying threatened or endangered population, you want to have as minimal impact on that population as you can. So that's sort of how I got started there along with my supervisor, and yeah, just dove right in, and I loved it.
Awesome. And speaking of diving right in, tell me how you started collecting it and what was your first experience successful?
Yeah, I think it was. So luckily, like, I wasn't, we kind of were lucky to work with a group that was already collecting scat from killer whales just south of the border in Washington. So
Mhm.
we had some communications with them, and they had published some papers already. So I was able to kind of really lean on their work. They had solved a lot of the mysteries of how best to collect killer whale feces already.
Mhm.
But essentially, we just have like a little kind of 1 liter bucket on a pole so we can lean over the side of the boat and scoop it up. The poop that we're collecting in particular tends to float for a little bit. So you have to be, somewhat quick in terms of getting in there when you know it's there, and can just kind of scoop it off the surface before it really dissipates and sinks.
All right. So now I really want to turn to some of the science that Kate and her colleagues are uncovering. Um, I know that, when the Rain Coast Conservation Foundation SCAT study on wolves, what they were doing with the Heldsick in Heldsick territory for about 10 years in the early 2000s, came out with their final some of their final data. It showed amazing genetic diversity of the wolves based on their habitat, and they linked some of that diversity to the linguistic groupings of people who'd been living on the coast for since time immemorial. So really mind-blowing stuff that we're able to see. Um, and yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing about the whales' turn now. So, Kate, when you were in the Salish Sea with killer whales, what were some of the results of the studies you did on the DNA?
Yeah, so Dr. Adam Warner from Raincoast was doing a lot of the DNA work on the scat that we were collecting, and piece of that work was to identify the individual whale that the feces actually came from. So out in the field, we don't necessarily know which whale has defecated because they're often in groups and we're just, a bit of a distance and we just find poop. And then, so that's a really important piece that the DNA work does, is to actually identify the whale that it comes from. That's really important to connect to other analyses that we're doing, because when you're looking at things like hormones or microbiome from the feces as well, it needs to be linked to things like the sex of the whale, so whether it's from a female or a male, the age of the whale, and we can't know that without knowing, which whale it came from. So that's just such a huge component of all analyses.
Hmm.
And then beyond identifying from the DNA which whale the feces came from, you can further look at things like the diet of the whales from the DNA in the feces. So not only is there the DNA of the killer whale, but there's the DNA of the fish or whatever it may be that the whale was eating, right? So
That's
there's
amazing.
really incredible studies that have looked at the diets of killer whales and other cetaceans based on feces, and can get really good ideas of like what, not just what species they're eating, but like what different proportions of different species. And some of the current work or more recent research is actually trying to get at not just the species, but like very specific runs. So what, very specific populations of salmon that are being consumed and that sort of thing.
So you can essentially tell what that previous whale's meal or meals for the last day or two were.
Exactly.
And then you can further connect it to, say, the salmon that are running into a tributary to the Fraser River. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. And I'm not, my specialty isn't genetics, so I'm not sure. I can't speak to how developed that science is, and I think it's sort of in progress and still figuring some of that stuff out. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then you are looking at another fascinating side of it, not so much maybe where the actual individual fish might have come from that the whales are eating, but you're looking at some of the impacts in the environment. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. So, when I was working on this, my focus was looking at hormones in the feces. And the point of looking at that, well, you can actually tell a lot of things from hormones, but what I was looking at was this concept of stress in the whales. So different hormones, like people often think of cortisol as the classic stress hormone, right? When you are stressed by something, your cortisol increases, and that's a measurable response.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in concept what I was looking at in the feces. So, but a few different hormones, right? So I was trying to get an idea of stress, both from just like general stress, but also in particular nutritional stress. And that can be done by looking at relative levels of different hormones in the feces.
So science knows the difference between how it appears if they have nutritional stress, e.g., they're not getting enough of something that they need, like fatty Chinook, versus other kinds of social stress or
To
survival
some
stress.
extent,
Yeah.
yes, to some extent. It's not black and white, but it's an emerging science, so it's something we're still kind of trying to figure out. But it is generally thought that thyroid hormones in particular, so it's a different class of hormones than things like cortisol.
Hmm.
So it's quite it's quite separate in terms of the molecular structure, I mean. But they like the thyroid hormones are thought to respond a bit more to long-term nutritional stress. So if you're, in a period of nutritional stress over weeks or months, not just like a short-term daily stress kind of thing, then your
Hmm.
thyroid hormone is thought to respond to that a bit more. But again, it's a little bit more complex than that. We're still figuring out the details. Like thyroid hormones and cortisol do interact with one another as well. So just to say, like, it's not cut and dry. You know, thyroid hormone does this in nutritional stress and cortisol doesn't. But it's kind of looking at those things together and trying to like paint the picture of what's going on, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I know the picture's not completely painted yet, but what are you seeing? What have you seen so far from your work?
So my work in particular was neat because it was the first to kind of look at two similar but different populations of killer whales. So we were collecting feces from both the southern resident killer whales as well as the northern resident killer whales. And as far as I know, it had never been collected in northern resident killer whales before, which are population that are fairly genetically similar to southerns in the grand scheme of killer whales. But are thought to be healthier as a population compared to
Hmm.
southern residents. So we really wanted to look at if there were population level differences in these hormones between the two that would give us any further insight into what's going on with the southern residents in particular. And
Yeah. And
gen-
if I could just interject here a minute for any listeners who don't know, the southern resident and northern resident killer whales are communities of these orcas that live in fairly distinct areas. Loosely, the northern residents live around northern Vancouver Island, the Great Bear Rainforest, and Haida Gwaii when they're on our coast, and then they head out to other places. And the southerns, when they're on our coast, tend to be around southern Vancouver Island, San Juan Islands, Washington State, Oregon, California. And because the two populations have these geographical distinctions, the southern residents have had more impact on them from humans because there's just so many more humans down here. That's really simplistic, but do you agree with that, Kate?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
perfect summary. Yeah. And thank you very much for adding
Yeah.
that. And yeah, essentially what we found supports other research that's already been done. And I will say that, we did have fairly limited sample sizes. As we heard from Alina earlier, it's sort of like this magical thing when you actually can collect whale poo. So you're always working with limited sample sizes. But we did see some differences at a population level in thyroid hormones specifically between the southerns and the northerns that would support the theory of the southern residents being more nutritionally stressed than the northern residents. So we weren't the first to show that. It's been, that's a theory that has been proposed for the southern residents for quite some time now, but it was just great to add another piece of evidence saying, yes, we see this in their feces as well.
Yeah. And nutritional stress for the southerns, I mean, ultimately, what's the outcome of that if nothing is done?
Oh, that's a scary thought, isn't it? So yeah, to try and make it super simple as you just did really nicely. I mean, nutritional stress is likely from a few things for the southern residents. So there's much fewer salmon and in particular Chinook on the south coast, which is the main diet of the southern residents. Not only that, but the Chinook are smaller and less fatty than they were many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And also contaminant levels are much higher, just based on what you said about, so many, such big urban centers in that area. There's more contaminants in the water and that sort of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
we really there needs to be like more protections and more policies for protecting the food supply, really, for protecting Pacific salmon and Chinook
Mm-hmm.
in particular.
Yeah. Protecting Chinook, that's hard, eh? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of their original spawning habitat has been dammed and so forth. Is that one of the main, other than ocean temperature rise and other things, one of the main contributors to the crash of Chinook?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of factors. Definitely, yes, in this like Vancouver, Seattle, Washington, Lower British Columbia areas, damming has really impacted their habitat. Commercial fishing over the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, like we really
Mm-hmm.
overharvested a lot of Pacific salmon stocks.
Yeah.
So that played into it as well. But yes, combination of habitat degradation and overfishing. And then now, newer threats of climate change as well, as you mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's a really sad potential future for the killer whales, and we all, I think, hold that in our hands right now as a community. And it's really hard to like shift the conversation away from that because it's so important. But I did want to ask you about any of the other findings that you think we will see down the road with the DNA analysis of feces that could help us understand the world of the whales and the world that we share with the whales more.
That's a good question. I do think um, what we were talking about earlier with the genetics of the prey and getting really specific into the runs, like that can be really useful for government to then put specific protections on those runs of salmon that are really vital to the killer whales. So like that's a really promising thing that's still kind of in progress, and I think will be really valuable. Another aspect of the genetics work is looking at genetic diversity within the population. And again, this isn't my area of expertise. You might even know more about it than I do, but my understanding is southern residents are pretty, there's like a few males in that population that have fathered a lot of the offspring. So there's kind of this like reduction in genetic diversity there, which as an ecologist, like our motto is diversity is the spice of life, right? Like that's how populations remain resilient, right? So that's like one component. Again, it's not my area of research, but there are others in this world looking at diversity within that population and how that might be affecting things. So that's, that's something in the future that could become really important as well. And then I guess the third thing that I would just say is looking at contaminants. That world is constantly changing too. Like, I'm forgetting it. It's the pesticide that was really popular in like the 70s and 80s, and then
was that
it was
DDT?
banned. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, like that was something that we just didn't know was so harmful, right? And then discovered it. Policy was implemented, and now it's like relatively not an issue, is my understanding. So as there are emerging contaminants and we learn more about like what's super harmful and what's affecting marine life, then that can really help, again, policy actions moving forwards and making sure we're keeping our oceans as clean as we can and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and painting the rest of the picture, as you say.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wanted to also ask, where can listeners learn more about your work, and also what your fantastic conservation-led organization, Skeena Wild, does? Is there Instagram or a website you'd like to share?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. Well, I believe in terms of like the genetics component, probably checking out the website for Raincoast Conservation Foundation would be a good start. I think they have details about the project on there. We are still in the process of publishing some scientific papers from this work, so a few hopefully will be coming out this year. So that's something I would have to follow up with you about.
Yep.
And then in terms of the work that I'm doing now with Skeena Wild Conservation Trust, I appreciate you asking that because I've kind of transitioned to working on the salmon side of things, just realizing how important that is for marine life. We do have a website and are on social media as well, Instagram, Facebook, all that. So yeah, please do check us out and see what we're doing to try and protect salmon in British Columbia.
Great. And we will link those in the show notes. And Alina, we are going to put some amazing photos you took of this expedition you had into the realm of whale poo, linked in the show notes below. So is there anything else you want to share with us about that?
No, I think the one picture really is kind of neat because it really does show what a perfect intact whale poo looks like. So
a rare sighting, rare than diamonds. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, very happy you're going to throw that on there.
So everyone check out the show notes. We're going to link Skeena Wild, Raincoast, and the magical pictures from Alina down below. Thank you both for sharing your stories with us today and your time. And also, I am looking forward to coming up speaking with Éadín O'Mahony, who is looking at genetics and other things we're able to discover from the blow of whales, like those humpback whales that Alina saw in Squally Channel. I'm delighted to welcome Éadín O'Mahony, who is going to talk to us about what she's discovering about humpbacks and their relationships through the breath they leave behind. She's a PhD candidate at the Sea Mammal Research Unit at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And she's worked here on this coast studying whale blows in Gitgat territory on the north coast of British Columbia for the North Coast Cetacean Society since 2017. Welcome, Éadín.
Thanks for having me, Maureen.
So there's a lot of interesting things that I want to ask you about your work and what you're studying. But first of all, I'm just picturing you as you've described yourself to me on a small boat in the middle of this giant fjord network that I know very well in Gitgad territory, flying a drone through the blows of these giant whales in the water beside you
Mhm.
for research. How did you get here? What was your story and your path to this?
Yeah, it's great to hear that be the description, I must say, because that probably is exactly my happy place, what you've just described. So I think the first thing I'd say is just, how lucky I feel I am to be in a position doing this work in Gitga'at territory. And what got me here really was a string of events that started with an internship. I was studying my undergraduate degree at the university, UCL, University College London, doing biodiversity and conservation degree in the middle of, this massive concrete jungle, and really just feeling this desperation to get out on the sea. And I came across the North Coast Cetacean Society, who run an amazing internship program every year, and was lucky enough to get offered a spot as an intern in 2017. And I guess I just absolutely fell in love with the place and with the people and with the work, and have just never really looked back since. Have been lucky to come back year and year again, to do the work. But specifically about the blow sampling, I think really what got us there was that that the North Coast Cetacean Society as an organization has a strict non-invasive policy when it comes to research. So, we're in it to protect whales. That's what our primary driver and our passion is. So and there's a range, and we can talk about the range of projects later, if you'd like, but there's so much incredible work going on. And really what I felt at the time was that the one piece of the puzzle that I really felt was missing still was having a molecular element, so the genetics of the whales. um, and the question was, how can we get the genetics without taking biopsy samples, which is quite an invasive way of, and the more traditional way of getting a blubber and skin tissue sample for genetics. So that's when we turned to blow sampling, and I set up the blow sampling and the drone work for NCCS for the organization in 2019, and it's just been growing since then.
Awesome. Yeah. And the North Coast Cetacean Society that you described, we have a long relationship with them as well. Like, what an incredible thing that they have done. I wonder if you could take a minute and, from someone who's actually lived on Finn Island, if you could describe that for our listeners. What's it like it seems dreamy to anyone who loves nature and whales that you're going to spend your whole summer on this rock.
Yeah, sure.
What's it like?
uh, it is dreamy, honestly. If you just picture this little wood cabin that sits on stilts, at the southern end of this uninhabited by humans island. I mean, there's lots of wildlife on the island that we get to share it with. But we just have our little wooden cabin, which is completely off grid, so it runs on solar power. And that's our research base where we live for 6 months of the year, doing the work. And I suppose what life is like out there, for me at least, my experience of it is that it's you get completely removed from the rush of normal life. I feel like we live in a time where all of us have a million things on the go at the same time. You're constantly connected through the internet and social media, and our phones in our hands or in our pockets all the time. And there's something about going to Finn Island where everything just slows down, and all of a sudden you have just one main focus. You're there to study and understand the whales and ultimately use that work to protect them. It's You live life very in tune with nature. And our day to day, the rhythm of the day is completely dictated by the rhythms of the sea, the weather, the tides, the whales, of course,
Yeah.
more than anything. And for that to be the driving force to your daily rhythm, I think is something very natural and very peaceful about it.
It
So
absolutely
yeah,
is. Yeah.
yeah,
I can really identify
mhm,
with that because I found when I used to work on our ships, that was one of the most beautiful things is that the rhythm of the days is entirely around natural things.
yeah, it's very special. And
Yeah.
I try to, because part of my work now over the last while, I've been very based in I'm in a city, I'm in a lab, I'm on a computer analyzing the data that we've been collecting. But I suppose I try to somehow hold on to some of those lessons from Finn Island in my day to day, and try to hold on to that mindfulness, I guess, of just getting
Yeah.
outdoors, even if it isn't with whales, as much as I would love it to be.
Before we get into the research, which I'm very interested in, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this population of whales that you're particularly studying.
Sure, yeah. Our work as an organization, we don't just work on humpbacks, but there's also a really unusual occurrence of fin whales in they come right into the fjord system of Gitgat territory, which fin whales are they're the second largest animal on earth. It's kind of crazy to imagine that they come so far inland into these fjords. So it's an amazing opportunity to study a species that usually is way far out at sea. So we dedicate a lot of our time to the fin whales, and the killer whales too, of course, the orca, the
Mhm.
residents and the transients that come and spend time in that system. And then there's the population of humpbacks, of course, who lend themselves very well to blow sampling, and I can speak more about that, but they're kind of a snotty animal. So they for blow sampling, they're a scientist's dream, honestly. And then I think, in this particular fjord system, because so the humpbacks migrate, they migrate all the way to tropical waters where they breed and give birth, and then they'll migrate back up to like BC, these temperate waters where they'll feed. So when they're in Gitgat territory, their sole focus really is foraging, and it's this very special place because it's relatively untouched. It's a very quiet soundscape. And for these whales, acoustics is everything. They're acoustic communicators. So to have a foraging habitat that is so quiet and untouched is really very precious. And they bubble net feed, and I'm sure you've seen it. These big groups of humpbacks
Yeah.
coordinating their behaviors. I mean, they're huge animals, and they have the spatial awareness to coordinate their behaviors in groups of 16, 17, 18 whales sometimes. Um, you know, spinning this net of bubbles around shoals of fish, and then all surging up as if being conducted by a conductor in an orchestra. It's really amazing
Yeah.
to see, as I'm sure you know. Yeah, so they're very special populations in the sense also that the fin whales and the humpbacks were completely pushed. They were completely depleted from commercial whaling and pushed almost to the brink of their extinction. And really, to get to be a part of watching them recover in this particular fjord system has been quite astounding. They've both done very well, especially the humpbacks. The North Pacific humpback whale population has really rebounded. So yeah, that's the kind
Yeah.
of context in which we do our work. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in the time I've been, part of Maple Leaf Adventures for about 22 years. And in that
Mm,
time, in the early days, we didn't see fin whales there at
mm,
all. And now it's quite regular and has
mhm.
been for a while that there might be a fin or six fins in among and the group coordinated bubble net feeding. We didn't see that in the early years either. We saw that starting, I can't even remember now, somewhere around 2010, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the importance also of having places like Finn Island, um, that are these research stations or floating research stations if it's more of a boat-based effort, but that are long term and that every single
Yeah.
year documenting the changes, because like that it allows us to know over bigger timescales what's going on. Like you've just said, over 20 something years, that you've seen it with your own eyes, the recovery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about these whales, I wonder if you might be able to introduce us and our listeners to some of the individuals that you know.
Sure. I think what I really think of first is the mothers that bring calves. I mean, they'll have one calf and maybe take a year out, and then all of a sudden they arrive with another calf the year
Mm.
after. And I think that's always really special because the calf stays at the mum's side for almost a full year, and goes on the full migration with the mum. So I think, especially from the drone's perspective, and having been able to watch some of these mother calf pairs and watching the calf dive under mum's belly and then swim back up to the surface for a little breath and then back down, hiding under her belly. So I think there's always a strong emotion associated with those encounters with
Yeah.
some of the mothers. And I think then also the individual personalities, there are some whales that solo bubble net feed by themselves. So they'll do this. They'll either group bubble net feed, or it's like they're almost not yet skilled enough to join the big group. So they'll be bubble net feeding by themselves in a way that almost looks like they're practicing. And with the
Uh,
bubble net feeding, I didn't, I didn't go into too much detail earlier, but there's a very specific feeding call that's used by the whales.
yes.
And we know that it's at a specific frequency that it vibrates the swim bladders of the fish, which causes them to clump together in an even tighter bait ball. And I imagine also that it somehow coordinates the group. But sometimes listening to these quote unquote practicing bubble net feeding solo whales, they're doing it on their own. When you listen to the feeding calls of it, they're just not quite getting it right. So it's this very neat encounter of a young whale just trying to like learn the ropes and figure things out. And because Finn Island, where we're based as a station, there's a little small bay right in front of us, and it seems to be this perfect practicing ground for these whales. So they come right in close, and they're just blowing their little crooked rings of bubbles around no fish, just practicing.
Oh, that is
Yeah,
lovely.
yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you for sharing. All right. I want to talk about many things, but let's
Mhm.
talk a bit about your very unusual way of conducting research. First of all, are you using a commercial drone for this?
Yeah, we do. We just use a DJI Mavic 2 Pro, which actually that was at the time one of the DJI more cutting edge drones, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, and the goal with the choice of drone model was that it's small, and has as little noise impact as possible. And it works really well. And I guess I
Okay.
should, yeah, yeah, go on.
Take us through a sample. So you are
Sure.
sampling whale blows, or I guess a little bit of snot.
Mhm.
We've talked about whale poo earlier in this episode. Take us through how you get a sample.
Sure. Um, I'll walk you through the perfect blow sample. So blow
Okay.
sampling from Finn Island gives us the opportunity to sample from land. That's the first thing. So these whales are coming incredibly close to shore because it's a fjord, so it's very deep water. So
Mhm.
I'm standing on the deck of our research station, and I never even need to switch on the outboard of our research vessel in order to collect some of these samples. Which, when you think about it from an approach of trying to be non-invasive, is
Yeah.
pretty cool, I would say. So I launched the drone. We work in teams, so there'll be somebody with the photo ID camera that's keeping an eye on the whale that we're targeting for that sample. And the drone has, of course, its camera on. It's recording everything in super high definition video, and I'm able to see in real time on the controller what the drone sees. So I'm able to locate the whale, fly over, and then really it's a matter of trying to get in tune with that whale's behavior and try to, I suppose, predict when and where it's going to come up for the breath so that I can position the drone, slightly behind the blowhole and at the right height so that it's getting literally covered in the blow. Um, I guess I should mention that we Velcro on these sterile Petri dishes onto the front of the drone. And it's in these Petri dishes that all of the droplets that are collected will end up becoming the sample. And we do all of this under, very specific permitting that we have. So I think
Yeah.
that's really important to say because
Don't
drones
try this
are.
at home. Yeah.
Do not try this at home. It is illegal to fly drones over whales, and especially the blow sampling, because we do get, we get close and we're specifically licensed and permitted and trained to do this work. But that's how it works. And then you bring
How high off the water on a good day when it's not windy does that blow go? And are you going for the top of the column or mid column or?
It's about 3 to 5 meter height. It's never perfect positioning. You're basically out there, and I try to get as many breaths in one surfacing of that whale as I can. So I just basically to just collect as much material and as much of the gooey blow as I can in the petri dish. But it really depends on weather conditions. As soon as there's a little bit of breeze, you know it yourself, right? The blow gets kind of flattened down towards the surface of the water. So you're just trying to gauge with the weather conditions and the wind direction and all of that, and just get yourself into that big bushy part at the top, basically.
The big bushy part. So there's a lot of snot in those blows, I take it.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
I've had one drift over me before, so now ick.
Yeah.
Anyways, so you collect it and then you fly back to the station and put the petri dishes in a freezer?
Almost pretty much. I mean, petri dishes come off. I wash them out with a preservative. It's called Longmire's buffer. It basically just stabilizes and preserves the DNA that's in that particular blow. And then it gets put in a little tiny vial, and that gets put in the freezer.
Okay.
And then eventually, fast forward many months, all of those frozen blow samples end up with me in the lab where I do all the lab work.
Okay, and what are you looking for? What is whale snot telling you?
You'd be surprised how much it can tell you. So we started with, I'll keep this brief because I could go on for years, as you could probably already tell I'm a talker.
Oh yeah, okay, give us an overview.
The specifically at the moment I'm looking at the humpback DNA, the whale DNA that's in the blow. But the sequencing method that we're using gives us information not just on the host or the whale, but also on its microbiome. So all of the bacteria and viruses that are within the respiratory tract, so that are being exhaled out by that whale as it's breathing. So from that single sample, we're getting information on its health, and we're getting essentially the entire genome now of the whale that breath came from. And then that information, in terms of ecological or genetic questions that you can ask, are essentially endless. I mean, it's an amazing source of information.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like you're creating an encyclopedia of each whale. And the same whales do return to the same area, right? I think it's called site fidelity. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. They have very high site fidelity to the area. And ultimately what actually motivated this work, and to begin with, the question that we had was, we have this we think it's an unusual occurrence. It might not be, but in the fjord system, these humpbacks show very strong social bonds with each other. So typically what people say about humpback whales is that they have what's called a fission-fusion society. So basically their social relationships are more fluid. They come and go, they'll join up, they'll bubble net feed together, then they part again. But actually what we're seeing, because of the long-term photo identification research that's going on, is that especially these females, there are these long-term bonds where, yes, they might part and migrate somewhere else, but they come back together and they spend time side by side in the fjord system. And the question underpinning that then is, what's the genetic relationship? What's the kinship of this social network? So that's what we're using the blow for, is to understand how related this population of humpback whales is to each other.
I wanted to also ask a little bit more about why what you're studying matters to humans and to the whales and their environment.
There is a number of ways of answering your question, because there are a number of reasons I think why this is important. The to me, the most important issue that's facing us in our particular research context is that there are going to be these liquefied natural gas tankers, these LNG tankers coming through the territory starting this year, starting pretty much as we speak. And we have done a study that looks at the risk that these tankers will pose to fin whales and humpback whales in the territory in terms of their strike risk. So if a whale gets struck by one of these tankers, it's lethal. And what we predicted in the models that we built was that for both fin whales and humpback whales, the mortality risk is so high that it's going to be unsustainable by 2030 for the recovery of the populations. So what we're predicting in the models, at least, is that what is currently recovering populations will begin to see a decline, which is a very, very scary thing. I remember it was a dear friend and colleague, Eric Keane, leading that study. And I remember us checking our own models and our math time and time again because we didn't quite want to believe the results we were finding. But that's
Did you say 2030?
By 2030, which is by when the year 2030, by when essentially LNG Canada will be at full effort, or so is predicted. So the full number of tankers that will come into the territory will be transiting at that point. And I think it was a twofold increase of mortality risk for fin whales and double that for humpback whales. And essentially that's unsustainable for both. So just to go back to your question, I think the reason why all this work is important is because we have a situation where we've been studying the whales for over, 20, going on 25 years, in an area that was relatively untouched. And now it comes a time where there's going to be this very serious anthropogenic threat on the populations, this, human-induced pressure. And so we're in a situation where we can use a whole range of scientific tools to try to at least document the impact that that's going to have, so that if it is going to have a very negative impact, then we have the proof to say so. And that feels like an opportunity, as painful in a way as it is for me to imagine the reality that faces us. I think, especially having spent time on Finn Island and around those whales for months on end, if the science that we do now can make a difference in scenarios where shipping routes, for example, are predicted in other parts of the world, and the science can stand to say that more strict protection measures need to come in, that to me is a job well done as an ecologist and as a geneticist in this case.
Yeah.
But that's maybe a more big picture answer, I suppose. I think it's all of these little projects. Well, they're not they certainly don't feel little, but each of these projects is one puzzle piece of a larger research goal, and that research goal is to really deeply understand how the whales are using the territory and what kind of threats they're faced with.
Yeah. Thank you. And I mean, I could talk to you about that sort of shocking stat of in 5 years it could be unsustainable for this absolutely incredibly beautifully recovering population filled with wonder that we've been seeing. But I do also want to ask you a little bit about some of the environmental DNA studying you've been doing as well. That's a little bit different from the snot, but it's part of the puzzle that you mentioned.
Yeah, it is. So the environmental DNA, or eDNA, I mean, the premise of it is in some sense so simple. Every marine creature leaves a little genetic trace in the water column that it lives within. So it's a really, again, non-invasive and neat way to go from, specifically studying humpback whales to all of a sudden getting an idea of the entire community in which the humpback whales are foraging, right? Because they're not living in isolation in this space. They're part of this network. Then, with the network links between their prey and, the critters that live off of, the lice that are living off of the skin of the whales and so on.
So it's this very interconnected network. So the environmental DNA stuff is pretty neat because we're trying to use it as a way to understand these congregation areas, these hotspot areas for humpbacks. And I mean, you may have experienced it yourself up when you head up into Verney Pass in September into October time. It's all of a sudden like this big congregation of humpback whales. And you can have huge numbers of humpbacks, right, in a very small space.
Yeah.
Like they're all right there in the middle of Verney Pass. And,
blows everywhere.
Blows everywhere. And it's the same individuals that are using Verney Pass at that time of year. So it's the same time of year every year, the same whales using the exact same little space. And actually, even when you sit and watch them, they're even coordinating their behavior. Like they all fluke roughly around the same time. They all go down. And then you look around, there's not a single blow for a few minutes and you think there's no whales around. And then, 5-6 minutes later, it's just blows everywhere again. So the question is why? What's driving the humpbacks into that space? Is it a question of their social network, their social connections? And is it more of a case of some kind of social gathering before they set off on their big migration again? Is it just a simple question of there's good food, they're foraging and there's good prey source there? Or is it something else? So that's where the eDNA comes in, because that way we get to map these congregation areas or these hotspots and really get a fine scale understanding of the relationships of the communities in the space.
I wanted to, before we wrap up, I wanted to round it out with a little bit of a tie back to our previous guests on this episode, which was our deckhand Alina. And also Kate, who is studying whale fecal samples. And I think Alina because she had this wonderful story about collecting some humpback whale poo and being very proud that she got it and taking it to the research station at Finn Island. And I believe you were the recipient of it. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, I can. I just remember getting handed this giant Ziploc bag of solid frozen orange whale poo. And it was like this glowing smile of pride, being handed over this poo sample, which in some sense, actually, that moment sums up so perfectly the excitement that I feel every time we collect one of these samples, whether it's blow or eDNA or poo or whatever it might be. Because I think it just, and I'm sure Alina can speak to this, it feels really good because you're doing no harm and there's just so much information in it that can be put to good use. So yeah, I got handed, and it was actually the day I was leaving. So just before I got on the boat to leave, I was like chipping pieces of whale poo. It was literally I must have been 1.5 liter size Ziploc bag. It was quite a lot to fit it into one of the little vials to take with me with all the blow samples into the lab. And that's, it's here with me in the lab now, the sample.
Wonderful. And in summing up, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to share how people can learn more about what you're studying and about these whales and the research station. Where would they look?
Absolutely. And the place to go is our website, which is bcwhales.org. So go to the website and there's loads of really nice photos and drone footage of the whales there. So for some of the stuff we've been talking about, that's all there. As well as the internship program for anyone, especially younger people who might be interested in studying this type of thing and getting into marine biology. The internship program to Finn Island, I couldn't recommend it enough.
It's been so great to speak with you, and I do look forward to connecting back with you again. We'll say hi to the whales when we're up there in Git-Gad territory, as I know you have to be in the lab this year, but we hope to see you back on the coast soon.
Yeah, please do enjoy the season up there, and thanks for having me on, Maureen. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to chat with you today about, some of my favorite things. So thanks for having me.
And for all of us here today, I think we now know that next time we're out on the water and see the reddish tinge of whale poop or get draped in the whale blow, rather than wrinkle our nose, we can pause and marvel, because in that floating cloud are stories about diet, health, relationships, waiting to be uncovered by scientists like Kait and Éadín. And if you enjoyed this, it would mean a lot if you could like this episode and subscribe to our podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.